this adventure, Mark, Ian, Daniel, Will, and I take on the Sole Duck Loop in the Olympic National Park in Washington State in September of 2024. This was a 4-night, 5-day adventure that took us about 55 miles across some of the Pacific Northwest's most scenic landscapes. But first, a quick overview of the route we had planned in all trails. We'd take the Sole Duck River Trail until its junction with the Appleton Pass Trail, then would do a 1-night out-and-back adventure to Boulder Lake via the Boulder Lake Trail. After rejoining the Sole Duck River Trail back at Appleton Junction, we would climb up to Heart Lake and down to Lunch Lake via the High Divide Trail, getting some good views of the Olympic Mountains, and then back to the trailhead, all in about 5 days. The trailhead was a 3.5-hour drive from downtown Seattle, so we all piled into the Bremerton Ferry and began the trek over to the national park. Arriving at the trailhead pretty late in the day at 5 p.m., we began the 2-hour hike to the first camp spot. Our spirits were high as we ventured into the woods, and being one of the largest temperate rainforests in the US, we began heating up as we continued longer into the humid air. We had planned to take the first half day and night pretty easy, and therefore, barely any elevation was gained as we began setting up camp as the sun set. Oh yeah! Oh yeah! Oh yeah! We sought out a nearby stream for some fresh water and took the opportunity to wash some sweat off.
Wait, what if we just hear the Enderman teleport sound? Good.
Prior to the camping trip, Ian and I had dried and sealed all of our food, and tonight's meal was our first sampling of our creations. Visually, both of our meals looked like something you'd dig up out of your sink's garbage disposal. These dried meals were generally pretty watery, but I was careful to ensure that they had enough protein, carbs, and fiber to power me throughout the following day. After a little bit of nighttime shenanigans, we called it a night. The next morning, after fooling around a bit, we began our most difficult day of the trip. We began the day buried deep in Sole Duck River Valley, and not before long, we began gaining elevation and got our first real views of the trip. Oh yeah, nice! Reaching the top of Appleton Pass, we took a brief break to refill on our water bottles at the tiny Oyster Lake before making a grand downhill. We stayed by a bubbling brook for a lot of the day, and thus I carried the minimum amount of water possible on my back. We took a couple breaks for some water filtration instead. After sketchily crossing the Boulder Creek Falls area, we began the final long uphill of the day, up towards our campsite at Boulder Lake. Being the longest day at around 5,000 feet of elevation gained and around 3,000 feet lost across 12.5 miles, we were all pretty pooped as we reached Boulder Lake. The first order of business was filtering water from the lake, and it was a little surprising to see such a smelly and stagnant lake. We tried to find the cleanest corner of the lake and set up our little water filtration camp. After dinner, we ventured to find the campsite's toilet. Being on such a popular route, many of the campsites we stayed at contained small outhouses in lieu of digging your own cat holes. We had a laugh at how the toilet was really a can with a lid perched over a pit. Will led a nighttime stretch session where we all took the opportunity to stretch our sore muscles before heading into bed for the night. The next day, we retraced our steps up to Appleton Ridge and Oyster Lake. Arriving at our camp spot fairly early in the day at 3:30, we had plenty of time to ditch the packs and wander around.
Shit ain't flat, bro. It's like 2 degrees off.
How will you be able to sleep tonight?
We decided on a scramble up to Little Appleton, where we'd hopefully get some good views of Solduck Valley. The wind began to pick up as we climbed past the trees, but the view was so worthwhile. One spaghetti dinner and one pretty sunset later, we were ready for bed. Daniel spent some time studying his laminated paper map, and not before long, the tiredness crept up to us and we crawled into bed. We spent plenty of time the next morning admiring the warm glow of the sun on Mount Appleton and got a late start to the day. The day after would prove to be our most beautiful day on the trail. The day began with the downhill retracing our steps back to our first night's camp spot at Solduck River at the bottom of the valley. Then we started on a long and steady uphill climb to the next point of interest, Heart Lake.
What's up, gamer?
What's up?
Now this part of the valley was the more well-traveled loop, and we began seeing more and more people. Heart Lake was a quaint little spot for a late lunch, and as we rested, dozens of hikers passed us by, some wading into the cool water and some resting in the grass that surrounded the lake. Mark and I took the opportunity to hop in, wading through the silt and mud at the bottom, and found that the lake only came up to our waists.
Loaded up that motor.
Ian, show me.
Oi, governor!
After a brief leech check and some lunch, we began our afternoon meander on the High Divide Trail over to the night's campsite. Once we got up on the ridgeline, we were rewarded with views into Solduck Valley on one side and the Hoh Valley on the other, with the snow-capped peaks of Mount Olympus far in the distance. We passed the time by identifying the smaller peaks along the way, and Daniel and I went head-to-head. Daniel preferred his classic map and compass, where I used my offline stash of Maps.me maps.
I think it's that.
The summit to Bogachil Peak was the highlight of the afternoon, after which we began our final descent of the day into Lunch Lake. Arriving relatively close to sunset at 6 p.m., we were surprised to see that a majority of the campsites at Lunch Lake were taken, and although we had camp reservations, we reluctantly took a spot furthest from the toilet, where we were greeted by a couple friends.
Whose dog is that?
I enjoyed a typical dinner consisting of rehydrated watery veggie mix, egg, rice, and gravy, and Will took a break from the typical dinner of his dry nuts to have an actual camping meal for once.
It's been so long. It's actually pretty good.
And meanwhile, Daniel added way too much water to his mashed potato mix.
This is soup! You added too much water! I need more potatoes!
That night, it was especially cloudless, so we took the opportunity to do a little bit of stargazing by the lake, and even with my poor iPhone quality, we were able to make a bit out of the Milky Way. That night was the coldest of the trip, dipping in the mid-30s, and therefore it was the night where we got the worst sleep. In the morning, we were greeted by the sun beautifully illuminating the hillside behind us. And as the sun rose, we used the sunlight to dry out our rain flies and tents as much as possible before packing away for the day. Ian and I got a head start from the group and started on our 7-mile return to the trailhead.
Bye, Mark.
Farewell!
The most remarkable event by far was spotting a black bear meandering its way up the slope, a good 300 or 400 feet away.
It's a bear.
Being that most of the day was downhill, our progress was fast, and before we knew it, we were back in the dense forest. Given our early start, we saw few people on the trail until we arrived at Deer Lake around 10 a.m., where the day hikers and backpackers going in the opposite direction as us began showing up more and more. Conversations about Safeway fried chicken were also making their rounds in the group as Mark, Daniel, and Will caught up to Ian and I, and therefore the motivation to get down to the car and back into civilization reached an all-time peak. And at last, we were back in the Solduck River Valley in the relatively humid rainforest. The wide gravel paths were somewhat of a relief to our sore muscles, and with a last final effort, we made it back to the trailhead.
Alrighty.
So yeah, that was a pretty fun adventure, and thanks for taking the time to watch and come along this adventure with us. This was the longest backpacking trip I'd been on, and we were more than ready to go home to our hot showers, warm beds, and Wi-Fi. Oh, and we did end up getting Safeway fried chicken on the way back. Alright, bye for now.